It gives me great pleasure to announce the next plenary on just transition. We're very pleased to have a great panel of politicians, of farmers, of researchers to address this really topical subject. And we're particularly pleased to have Thin Lei Wen back with us, because you might remember, if you're here in Malawi, she led us through another challenging topic, the right to food and trade, and always has an opportunity to get us thinking about some of the ethical and other issues that relate to our subject of agriculture, nutrition, health. So, Thin, may I hand over to you?
Good afternoon, everybody. I know that, after lunch, after tea time is not the best to start a plenary, but hopefully this will be a lively and interactive discussion, and you'll be brought along to this. So again, welcome to this plenary session on just transitions to everybody in this room, as well as to those who are joining us online. Like Jeff said, my name is Thin, and I'm a journalist specializing in food systems, including as lead reporter for the Food Systems newsroom of Lighthouse Reports. And I'm delighted to be moderating this session. Now, if you have been following the discussions around the climate crisis, you're probably already familiar with the term just transitions, right? And it's normally used and evoked when we're talking about, transitioning to decarbonizing our economies. And it's usually talked about when we say that, okay, in the process of us moving to these low carbon technologies and industries, we really need to make sure that that process is fair, especially for communities whose livelihoods will be affected by this transition. So coal miners, for example, right? When we talk about, okay, we're going to shut down coal mines, what does it mean? How can we make this transition fair for these workers who will be losing their jobs? But we don't talk about this principle often enough when it comes to food systems. Now, the UNDP defined this principle as, and I quote, the whole of society, all communities, all workers, all social groups are brought along. We often talk about the fact that we really need our food systems to be fairer, greener, and healthier, and that we need this transformation to be urgent. But we sometimes don't talk about or think about the fact that we're going to need to make shifts to transform our food systems, and that these shifts are very likely going to exacerbate existing challenges and inequalities. So how do we do this much needed transition while centering justice so that food producers, as well as consumers, and particularly vulnerable people who are struggling to afford food and grow food, are not left behind, right? So how do we do that? It's a difficult question. We're not going to find answers in an 80-minute session, but we're hoping that this will be, part of an ongoing discussion that will make us think about just transition as we talk about food systems transformation. I'm very lucky to have a panel of fantastic speakers, like Jeff said, from a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences, policymaker, farmer, researchers, academic, who are going to be looking at this transition at multiple levels. And we're going to have a few rounds of panel discussion, and then we're going to open the floor for Q&A. So if you have any burning questions, keep that with you, and then we will definitely come back to you. I'm now going to introduce the speakers for this panel, and to be fair, I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. So first, we have Aditi Mukherjee, Director of the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Impact Action at the CGIAR. Aditi, come on to the stage, please. Next, we have Guy Singh Watson. Guy is a farmer and founder of Riverford, which is a very successful organic vegetable business, and it is now 100% employee-owned and based in the UK. Guy is joining us online. Next, we have Mishak Sikuku, Regional Coordinator on Sustainable Agriculture with Ripple Effect, which is a UK-registered charity working with farmers in East Africa. We also have the Honourable Neema Lugangira, a Member of Parliament in Tanzania. We really appreciate her for being here despite the busy schedule. And last but definitely not the least, we also have Robert Kibuki, who is Associate Professor of Law at the University of Nairobi. He's also joining us online. So for the first round of questions, I really want to start with setting the scene, right? Because just transitions for food systems might mean different things to different people, right? So my question is, what does just transition in food systems mean to you in a practical sense? And Nima, can I come to you first, given that you are a policymaker in the host country that is hosting ANH?
First of all, good afternoon, everyone. As introduced, I'm Nema Lugangira, Member of Parliament in Tanzania. Actually, I have 2 more days, or I should say 1 more day to my mandate, because our parliament is dissolving on Friday this week. And actually, my being here attests my personal commitment to nutrition, but also echoes the commitment from our parliament. Because ideally, being that this is the last week of our mandate, I should be in parliament. But having been given or granted the possibility to be here, thus not being in parliament today, that echoes the commitment of our parliament and our speaker. So I'd like you to join me in giving a round of applause to my speaker for Right Honorable Tulia Axon for her dedication and commitment to the nutrition agenda, thus me being here. Now, when we're talking about just transition, I think it's very critical because Tanzania, like many other countries, we're an evolving economy. And as an evolving economy, the link, for many years, there hasn't been a link between agriculture and nutrition. So I think it's very commendable that we have such a platform as the ANH that brings together agriculture and nutrition together. So when we're talking about just transition, to me it's like looking at policy. How can we improve nutrition by using the agricultural sector as an accelerating vehicle towards us getting there? That's how I see the just transition, and it's a lot of policy elements involved, but also it's a multi-sectoral element. It's not just the agriculture sector that can work on it. You have the health sector, it has to be involved. You have the water sector, has to be involved. You have, even infrastructure has to be involved, telecommunication, etc. But there's also components of gender equality, gender-based violence, and so many things in that. So I think in a nutshell, that's what I can say. But once again, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you.
Thanks, Nima. And I think, what you're talking about is really commendable, because I think for a very long time, Ministry of Agriculture has been seen mostly for productivity, right, and yield and efficiency, and nutrition has been an afterthought. So it's great to hear that you're actually looking at linking those two together. Misha, can I come to you next? From the perspective of a farmer in Kenya, but also somebody working with farmers in East Africa, what does just transition mean to you?
Thank you. I think to my thinking, just transition has to do with ensuring that nobody loses out in the process of transition. And in most cases, even as we are now, when we look at our African countries, sub-Saharan Africa, the people who are losing a lot, with climate change are smallholder farmers, the fisher folks, the women, people living with disability. These are marginalized communities that are disadvantaged, communities that live in very delicate landscapes who are hit by climate change. And so when we are talking about just transition, we are talking about inclusion of these minorities, of these groups, of these smallholder farmers, just to ensure that even as we, transition from high carbon economy, high carbon farming systems to low carbon food systems, we ensure that these communities are not forgotten, but they equally and in a fair way share the benefits of the transition.
Thank you so much for that, Meshach. Aditi, can I come to you next, because you've done a lot of research on this topic and would like to hear your thoughts from it.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me on this panel. This is a very important topic because I think all of us here in this room know that 197 countries of the world had come together in Paris in 2015 and signed the Paris Agreement that tells us that 1.5 degree is literally a red line when it comes to temperature increase. We are right at the threshold of that 1.5 degree. So 1.5 degree is a science-based target, but it's also a moral and ethical target, because it means the science is very clear that as and when we cross 1.5 degrees, the impacts are going to be felt across all the geographies, but disproportionately on the smallholder farmers, on the producers, and on those who have least contributed to the climate problem. And as we sit here, last year we crossed 1.5 degree for the first time. It doesn't mean that we have breached the 1.5 degree, but it means that we are very close to breaching that. In that context, what IPCC also says is that we have to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 to remain within the pathways for 1.5 degrees. And instead of reducing emissions have been actually going up. So this brings us to what just transition means in the agri-food sector. What it means that if all the sectors have to reduce their emissions, agriculture also needs to reduce. Right now, a lot of the decarbonization, emission reduction focus is very much rightly so on the fossil fuel sector, on the energy sector, on the transport sector. But for us to live within 1.5, agriculture also has to reduce emissions. But we have to do so in ways so that those who have least contributed to the problem are not the ones who are actually getting unfairly affected. So just transition means, how do we go to a low emission pathway in agriculture through the right balance of technologies, institution, policies, and finance that does not penalize the smallholder farmers and the producers. So in some ways, it is in the heart of climate discussions right now. Right now, what's also happening in Bonn, and I was there last week, is the midterm climate talks. They call it the subsidiary body that happens in Bonn every year. And right now, the discussions on just transition work program has been actually stalled around issues of finance, which is kind of pretty common, happens all the time. But in that just transition discussion, agriculture is emerging as an important topic. So in some ways, the discussion of just transition in agriculture is not so different from energy. It's basically, how do we move to low emission by protecting the livelihoods of those who would be most affected. So I think that's the more or less the general understanding of where just transition means in this context. Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditi. Robert, can I come to you next? You are professor of law, so you have a legal understanding and definition of what is a just transition. But you also work, I understand, with farmers. So maybe you can put on both of those hats to tell us what just transition is in practice.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity and for having me this afternoon. I had planned to be there in person, but last-minute medical hitches made it impossible. I would just build on what has been said by the speakers coming before me, that the focus is on decarbonization, essentially because of dealing with the problem of global warming. But from particularly a smallholder context, which is the most common in our part of the world around, sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the East African region, when we worry about that, we are more focused on a low carbon pathway because it has got the dual benefit of bringing adaptation, such as land restoration, but also in sequestering carbon. I'm talking about, for instance, dealing with soil fertility or even basic aspects like agroforestry. However, the focus nonetheless has to be in that transition. How do we deal with the resilience problems around the vulnerability to climate hazards? Basic questions sound basic, but still persistent problems like land tenure, secure land tenure, and access to land, productive land. And how do we, for instance, deal with the losses that come in the stalled transition from the climate hazards? How do we deal with income protections from farmers? How do we deal with the losses that come from long-term droughts, for instance, in the form of insurance, knowing that conventional insurance for crops is ridiculously expensive and difficult to implement. How do we deal with basic aspect at farm level, like land use management, so that it is combining a low carbon pathway, but also benefits that are related to adaptation? And I think with that, you can see, speaking from a policy perspective, there's a combination of mixes of policy tools that are need to be in place for that. But at farmer level, one of the more common things that I have seen in different parts of Kenya is an increasing focus to worry about land restoration. How do we restore the land? Because land degradation has taken away the quality of the land and the ability of the land to support farming, and even to support the growth of nutritious foods because of the excessive use of chemical, fertilizers and pesticides to deal with that. So there is quite a bit of that to worry about, but we must make sure not to also forget the most vulnerable and get very carried away with the decarbonization agenda. And remember, in this case, we need to focus on the trajectory towards low carbon agricultural production, but worry about the resilience shocks that continue to deal because of high levels of vulnerability exposure. And I think in a subsequent question, I could get into the details of those tools. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Robert. And you're absolutely right. Land is a very, very key issue when it comes to just transition, right? Access to land, security of land tenure. Guy, welcome. We're just talking about what does just transition means to you in a practical sense. And, as a farmer in an industrialized nation, but who have sort of bucked the trend, what are your thoughts?
Well, I wish I could be there with you in presence, and I'm sorry that I'm late. Yeah, a just transition has to be one that's fair to current generations wherever they live, and future generations, and maybe even to non-human inhabitants of our planet. And we're a very long way from that in the UK, where market forces are pushing farmers to ever more intensive monocultures and ever greater scale, and more people being driven off the land. I mean, agriculture is a very small part of GDP, perhaps 1.5%, yet we're contributing to 50% of biodiversity loss, and depending on who you believe, somewhere between 10 and 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. The market forces are leading us in the wrong direction. I firmly believe that we need redistribution of land. We need smaller entrants who tend to be farming in a more agroecological way, and that's the way that we need to be encouraging farmers to do that. And that is not going to be supported by our government. In the case of Riverford, the business I founded, it was supported by the will of our customers, where we're in a very unusual situation of being able to communicate directly with our customers and have them support the sort of farming that we want to do. That is very unusual for most, well over 90% of food in the UK is sold through supermarkets, where there is no connection with the end consumer. So I guess my main point is that we need government action to get some justice, and unfortunately there's very little appetite for that. We are certainly not going to get a sensible agricultural policy from the marketplace, where there are just so many externalities that aren't measured, but that will have great consequence to future generations. I'm really concerned in the UK about us exporting some of our environmental footprint of food production. So whether that's by importing soya from deforested lands in South America, or whether it's by exporting our carbon footprint, and with bogus carbon trading schemes, which I have seen some of in East Africa, I think, which are should never be supported, actually. And in the UK, of course, we were the first to industrialize, though we have actually done a fair amount on our greenhouse gas emissions over the last couple of decades. We've got a lot of catching up to do.
Thanks, Guy. We're definitely going to come to Robert and Nima later to talk specifically around policy environment and policies and what governments can do for just transition. But for the next round, I want to look at just transition at multiple levels, right? And I think of course, the very key and the core part of just transition is how do we make sure there is just transition for food producers, for farmers, right? And Guy, I want to start with you again, just because it's a very concrete example of where Riverford, if I'm correct, I think it was about 2 years ago, right, where you essentially, Riverford became 100% employee owned. And I have a two-part question, and it's linked to some of the main points that you make earlier as well. So what is it like to run a farm that is, organic and agroecological, in a context where pretty much the norm is to go industrial scale and monocropping? And number two, what was your thought process around essentially turning over your farm and your firm to employees as part of that whole, just transition process?
Perhaps I'll respond in reverse order. I mean, the reason, my thinking behind it is that I think any sort of environmental justice has to be linked to social justice. And I found myself running a business with 1,000 plus employees, where essentially under stakeholder capitalism, I was the beneficiary of that just seemed all wrong. Starting 7 years ago, Riverford progressively became employee owned. So now I had the co-owners, control the direction that the business goes in and shares in the profits. And I'm one of 1,500 co-owners today. That just coincides with my sort of philosophical beliefs about how we should live together, I suppose, and how we do farm on a reasonable scale. We are not a small scale producer. We farm hundreds of acres. We're reasonably mechanized. But even with that scale, we find it very difficult to compete with an industry which is just absolutely brutal in the way the prices have been driven down by our supermarkets. And that's left to people cutting corners in all sorts of ways. Absolutely abhorrent employment practices where plane loads of people are flown in from all over the world to do the work that British people, don't want to do in the fields, and farmers being driven to farm in a way that I think many of us know is wrong. That's degrading our soils, leading to loss of biodiversity, and massively contributing to climate change. We are able to buck that trend a bit by virtue of the support of our customers. We are now probably something like 50% more expensive than a supermarket by virtue of farming in the way that I think most people would like to see farming in the UK. But that is becoming very difficult. And as we live in more economically stressed times, I have to say this is, our customers I don't think we can be any more expensive. So, whilst we have, all the costs of climate change and biodiversity loss being externalized, farmers aren't paying them. It's very difficult to see how farmers can improve their practices. The kind of neoliberal market-based solution for everything, which in the West, I think is taken, and probably increasingly globally is taken to be the answer to everything, is failing us in agriculture and food, and leading to really horrendous diet-related illnesses, and as I say, biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on, all for 1.5% of GDP. Is just it's insanity. We are able to farm differently through the support of our customers, but it is becoming increasingly difficult even there.
Thanks so much for that, Guy. And it's really interesting what you said about how in trying to do it right for the environment and for your employees, it means customers now have to pay more. And Aditi, I want to turn to you next to hear your thoughts, reflecting on what Guy has said. But I also know that when we were discussing earlier about the panel discussion, you were also talking about some of the key pillars that you said were needed for just transition. So maybe some of that may be helpful in essentially ensuring that consumers aren't penalized for just transition for farmers and the environment.
Yeah, and Guy actually says is correctly trying to do the right thing increases the cost of production. And it need not be so. And that has happened because, well, again, I'll go to the energy sector before I come back to this. Today, it's actually cheaper to produce electricity using solar panels, most renewable, compared to thermal energy. And that was no accident. That happened because there have been investments in renewable energy for the past 30, 40 years, driving down the cost of solar panels. Such commensurate research of how do we actually make the low emission technologies most cost effective has not happened in the food and agriculture sector. Right now, if a farmer wants to adopt any kind of low emission technology, grow crops with less fertilizers or don't use fertilizers, actually the cost gets like pushed up. So that's true. We do not have, like, there we have green ammonia as a fertilizer, but that's way more expensive than the traditional chemical fertilizers. We do have technologies that might bring down methane emissions in livestock, but they are more expensive than the other more the traditional technologies. So that brings me back to the first pillar, and that is actually a reason. If it's not cost effective, there's no way we can ask farmers to adopt those things. We cannot ask farmers to lose out their livelihoods, which we know in the context of global south are already quite precarious. So in that context, our first pillar that we have been talking about a lot is increased investments in R&D. How do we make these low emission technologies cost competitive with the current conventional green revolution kind of chemical intensive agriculture? And that will only happen, one of the components of that would be more R&D investments into it. So that for us is the first pillar. The second pillar is that those investments, while they happen, there would be a lag effect. Like we know agroecological, many of you are experts in that. While agroecological approaches can compete, but it takes time. It takes up to 6 to 7 years before the yields are at par with chemical agriculture. So during the transition time, the second pillar that we are talking about is transition support. Who supports that loss of income? In your case, Guy, your consumers are supporting it, but where would we find such conscious consumers? Everywhere. And already in a developing country context, the cost of food is a big item in somebody's budget. So that basically, during the transition period, we actually need transition support and finance. And the third one is there's a lot of lack of policy coherence. There is basically incoherent policies in pretty much all the countries. On the one hand, we have committed to climate change 1.5 degree. On the other hand, basically providing a lot of subsidies to chemical agriculture. So the third pillar then has to be coherent policy change. And if we can somehow bring these three together, then perhaps in whatever 5, 7, 8, 10 years down the line, we would find that there are technologies and approaches which makes these low intensive, low emission farming just as cost competitive or even better than conventional ones. Yeah, back to you.
Great, thank you, Aditi. That's very clear. And I guess I'm hoping that everybody in this room and online is now going to go and try and make sure that all those three pillars are going to be available so that we can have just transition, hopefully in a decade or so. Mishak, I want to hear about your experience in East Africa on how do we make just transition work for farmers? What are you doing? What is Ripple Effect doing?
Most of the presentations I have seen here, I think they agree with the fact that we already have a problem. The problem of malnutrition, the problem of food insecurity, the problem of land degradation, and therefore we need action. And I have heard even in climate discussions at the global level, many leaders have said one thing, that the action is now. It's not tomorrow, it is already too late. And therefore, we as Ripple Effect, we are working with the communities. We are putting some of these actions that we are talking about in practice. So one of the actions that we are taking is exactly the way my fellow panelists said. We are training farmers to adopt regenerative practices, agroecological practices that minimize the addition of highly hazardous chemicals, the pesticides, the herbicide, and replacing them with ecologically friendly pest control methods. simple activities such as complementary cropping, polyculture, use of repellents, for example, repellent crops within a cropping system or within a farm. They might appear to be very simple, but they are agroecological practices that farmers can put into practice to minimize the level of degradation using highly hazardous chemicals, which they use. Secondly, we are looking at how do we regenerate lands. I think Professor talked about land degradation. 95% of smallholder farmers or East African population depend on agriculture. That is their livelihoods. And therefore, if land is degraded and it can no longer produce, that is why we are seeing these cases of malnutrition going higher and higher. And I think one of the presenters yesterday said that if we continue with the same trend, and then in 2050, we are going to have a reduction in agriculture production by 30%. What does that mean with regard to malnutrition, the problems that we are talking about? So we are training farmers to regenerate land and landscapes, be it pastoral areas, because sometimes we forget pastoral communities as well, who depend on rangelands, for example, for the food of their livestock. So we are training farmers to regenerate their lands, to reduce and minimize external inputs. But we're also facilitating learning, because learning is very important. Extension support. I know that in most of our governments have limitations in terms of resources to facilitate agriculture extension. And therefore, we are working with the communities to ensure that we have models that can be at the community level and that can facilitate peer-to-peer learning. For example, we have a model called peer farmer training model. So the peer farmer training model is one of the models where some of the farmers we work with and who are willing to support others, we train them to mentor and to support, and use their farms even as demo plots and support others. So, but then also, knowledge and information is very important. Access to knowledge, for example. Farmers need access to knowledge, and that's one of the challenges that farmers do not have. Especially, for example, if you look at how farmers apply fertilizers, they just apply it anyhow. They just buy and apply, because ideally, soil is supposed to be analyzed, and then farmers will need to apply only the required amount of, for example, nitrogenous fertilizer within the soil. But the whole of that system doesn't exist. And where even it exists, the service providers are normally private laboratories who do what? Who are expensive and sometimes very far away to reach. So what do farmers do? They just go buy the chemical fertilizers, then they apply into their farms regardless of whether that fertilizer is required or not. So these are the trainings that we are offering to farmers so that they can be able to produce sustainably in a localized manner and adapt sustainably. Yeah.
Thank you, Meshach, and thank you for actually mentioning pastoralists, because we tend to forget, when we're talking about on farm, we tend to think of the, the farm in a specific fixed location, and we tend to forget and how vulnerable they are as well as a result of climate change. Robert and Nima, I want to turn to you for this round now, because I want to hear about policy environments and the policies that are needed to ensure that there is just transition. Robert, can I come to you first? And then Nima, I'll come to you after Robert.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just build up on what has been said before. I'd like to affirm that really this problem of a just transition in agriculture in the East African region is quite real. Context being, for instance, that 75% of populations across the board are 35 years and younger. So we're looking at significant demand for nutritious and affordable food production in a consistent way over the years, but also looking at an opportunity for meaningful economic engagement for highly educated and skilled people across the value chain. But be that as it may, from a policy perspective, I think to me the most fundamental one must still be clarification of and protection of land tenure rights. And this is because when it comes to smallholder farmers, without clarification and protection of tenure rights, people will end up unable to invest knowledge. Because of that uncertainty, they will also end up farming in marginal lands riverbanks, riparian areas, or even places where nobody should be farming. But also, it's also in this region, countries are now beginning to deal with the pesky problem of community land rights in the rangelands. And these are areas that occupy, in some instances, over 70% of the country and have suffered massive land degradation, and they need to have those land rights formalized and secured. Otherwise, conversions, unequal, non-inclusive giving up of land for carbon projects that are incompatible with pastoralism and rangeland agroecology, etc., will continue going on. The second one I'd like to echo is what Aditi said about policy coherence. And this to me is quite fundamental because we realize that in our region, when it comes to agriculture, we are contending with exposure to vulnerability as a result of global warming. And the policy initiatives that we take really need to address this problem in a meaningful way. So for instance, if you look at Kenya's current climate change action plan, it prioritizes land restoration in 2.5 million hectares of rangelands. The need is actually 5 million hectares, but the financing over 5 years from public sources is about 400,000 hectares, which tells you that we're not even scratching the surface. But on the other hand, while we do that, we also see governments that are continuing to approve the construction of roads through montane ecosystems. We just had an environmental impact assessment challenged in court that approved the construction of a 54-kilometer road through the Aberdares Forest and National Park, a major montane ecosystem and permanent source of rivers. On the other hand, while we recognize that we are facing problems with soil fertility and damage, we continue to subsidize mineral and chemical fertilizers. For example, the encouragement of the use of diammonium phosphate, which creates a secondary problem for smallholder farmers through soil acidification, and they have to incur an additional cost to deal with that problem of soil acidification. So that level of policy coherence, I think, is required, and I suppose it's one of the areas that requires a lot of mainstreaming of climate consideration. And then there are protections. What kind of protections do we need to provide from farmers across to consumers across the value chain? And if we talk about farmers, I would speak about 2 or 3 very quickly. I'm very concerned that, for instance, the Horn of Africa experienced a consistent drought from 2014 through to 2018 and again through to 2022. 4 to 8 years considered to be the most extensive drought in 40 years, followed very quickly by desert locust, followed very quickly by COVID. In that instance, massive loss of livestock, massive loss of food crops. What kind of policy initiatives do we need to protect incomes and to protect assets, especially that are at farm level, whether it's livestock or whether it's the crops? And so we need to look deeply into income replacement or income protection policies, bearing in mind, of course, that smallholder farm level incomes are often wage-based and often very low. But nonetheless, the withdrawal of that income on the basis of extreme weather events leaves families in very vulnerable situations that even can result in malnutrition, leave alone the question of transition or sometimes even loss of life. So do we have options for income replacement? Do we have options for large-scale types of insurance that can be used? I think we've seen experimentation with index-based insurance in the livestock sector, and Kenya, for instance, has got a new policy that is advancing the question of index-based insurance for crops as well as livestock farmers on account of that. And then finally, there is the question of awareness. I think really we must always be sure to know that the farmers who are affected have a lot of information, and the disconnect between farmers and policymakers sometimes can result in the adoption of wrong policies, and this can also affect another need in policy, which is research and development that is relevant and that is responsive to the need at hand and that is adequately funded. As I conclude on this point, I'm always surprised when you talk to farmers then you talk to public agriculture extension officers, and you find the disconnection. And the connection for solution for farmers is often to the private sector extension officers who are trying to solve a problem by selling a product, but may not have the public interest at hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Nima, that was quite a suite of policies that Robert suggested. Would love to hear your thoughts as somebody who's working on improving these issues.
Thank you. I think Robert has covered everything, and we can clearly see why he is the professor. He has covered very comprehensive policy issues there. I think what I can say on my end is obviously going back to what a lot of the speakers have said and what I earlier said, is that to truly achieve just transition in the way in which I think we aim for, we have to make sure that we have national strategies in place that are both multi-sector and multi-stakeholder. So for example, here in Tanzania, we have the National Multi-Stakeholder Agriculture Action Plan, MNAP. And we had the first phase, which was from 2016-17 to 2021, 2. And then now we're in the second phase. And in there, you can already see how our government took a learning from the first phase of the MNAP to the second phase. But what the MNAP also does is it places direct responsibilities to those different sectoral ministries. Whereas if you have, let's say, a nutrition-related strategy under one sector, then it's not a guarantee when it goes to the ground, it will be implemented multi-sectorally. So it's so what the MNAP does is that there's key responsibility for the Ministry of Water, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, education. So they're all forced to work towards this, achieving this just transition, as what this panel is saying. So I think that's number one. Number two is one of the ways or one of the challenges of achieving a lot of the things that we've said here is access to finance. And when we're talking about access to finance, then we even need to go even a bit further and look at the access of finance of smallholder farmers. Then when you look at smallholder farmers, you need to dig deeper and look at women, because accessibility of funding for women is entirely different. Most women don't own land, so if they don't own land, they don't have the collateral. There are lots of financing mechanisms that takes into account this lack of collateral. But then you find those who will benefit or will be able to take advantage of these different platforms that are financing platforms available are going to be women closer to that ecosystem. So women who are furthest away from rural regions, peripheral regions, border regions are most likely not going to be able to take advantage of such platforms. So then how do you make sure that you engage and you ensure that this opportunity reaches all? So that's the second item that I wanted to bring on board. Then number three, I think my colleague here was speaking about the use of technology. The use of technology is very commendable. We have different tools, different softwares to support smallholder farmers and everything. That's great. But we never stop to ask ourselves, do smallholder farmers know how to use them? Then there's the issue of technology, the digital capacity, their understanding. Okay, we're producing all of these tools, great intention, but the target group, do they know how to use it? That's number one. So making sure that people can actually use these tools. But then number two, is there even digital access? What about the accessibility? And then what about the cost? So all of these things need to be taken into account. Is one thing just having the tool in place, an entirely different thing making sure that people can access those tools and they can use them, and then they can it can be implemented in their work. And then finally, I think one of the best ways of achieving and being in line with just transition is exactly like in this panel. Oftentimes these discussions are done in silo. So you'll find that folks in the agriculture sector or in academia would be discussing among themselves, talking about policy-related issues or legislative-related issues without politicians. And then there is an assumption that politicians are not going to get us, politicians are not going to understand. This is just for us to discuss. But then we're forgetting that it is those very same people who you're leaving aside are the ones who will discuss and be creating those policies, be creating that environment which you want it to be an enabling environment. So I think it's very important to making sure that we find ways in which we can bring these different worlds together and making sure that we have such discussions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think the whole idea of breaking the silo has been almost a theme of this conference as well. I think it's been repeated time and again from Monday until now, Wednesday. Now, before we move on to the next stage of the just transition, which is looking at consumers, Guy, I want to come back to you very briefly because you've already mentioned about the fact that, in the UK and industrialized nations, the farming practices have not been environmentally friendly, right? Biodiversity impacts, ecosystem destruction, greenhouse gas emissions. And it's, if I may use another climate term, you've got the common but differentiated responsibilities, right? That certain countries historically has been responsible for more emissions than others. And it feels like we have the same in food systems as well, where farmers in industrialized nations have been historically responsible for the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and that's CO2, methane, N2O. Guy, you have been a little bit pessimistic about the possibility of changing that, but I still want to ask you, do you see it? How can we make these farmers change their practices, or is it even possible?
Well, certainly don't follow the example that we've set in the West, I would say. I mean, my recent trip with Meshach to East Africa, I was horrified by the loss of trees, particularly in southern Uganda, since I first went there 25 years ago. But then I come home to England and I get on the train to go back to my farm and I look out the window and I see, we cut all our trees down 300, 400, 500 years ago. We're just, and actually we're one of the most nature, we have the least biodiversity, the least tree cover of anywhere in the developed world, really. So, I mean, I guess I'd mainly say, don't follow our example. We've got a hell of a lot of catching up. We burnt more fossil fuels and coal and whatever before anyone else. We had the first industrial revolution, the first agricultural revolution, and we have made a mess of it. And there is a reluctance of governments to, as I've already said, I've led my entire adult life under this obsession with neoliberalism and letting the market decide. And it has been absolutely disastrous. And it's, just a totally inappropriate approach for agriculture. And so we do need leadership. We need an agricultural policy. We need a food strategy. We need those things, two things to be linked up. And we need not to leave the future of our planet and our, in terms of biodiversity and so on, but also our nutrition. We just cannot leave that to Cargill and Syngenta, who have really, I would say, dictated the direction that agriculture has gone since the end of the Second World War. So we need good, strong leadership, and we need to definitely not follow the example set by USA, the UK, Australia, where we have, grotesque consumption and completely unsustainable consumption of animal proteins. We have a ongoing pressure towards, as I say, scale and monocultures. And I think, quite frankly, I see better farming practices on some of the farms that I visited with Meshach, and more sophisticated agriculture, and agriculture which learns more from nature is definitely more sustainable than anything I see in the UK. And I would include my own farm in that, actually. We're also subject to commercial pressures where we end up doing things that I know, I shouldn't be doing just to stay afloat commercially. So, Finn, I hope I answered the question there. Is that?
You did somewhat, in a sense, don't follow in the footsteps of the UK and the US and industrialized nations. And
sorry, if I just be, you asked me to be a bit more positive. I mean, I was so inspired by some of the farmers that Meshach showed me, and and just how incredibly productive an agroecological approach can be. And I've taken some of that over 25 years. I've taken that home and employed some of those techniques on my own farm, and I'm seeing that it can be win-win-win, win for biodiversity, win for climate change, and win for productivity. But it is incredibly difficult and knowledge intensive, as I've heard some of the other speakers say, and that's what we need to be investing in, most particularly is knowledge. And the frustrating thing is that 70% of British citizens are prepared to pay more for their food and to support this sort of agriculture. So the fact that we're not getting it through our market is really an example of market failure, I would say.
Great, thank you, Guy. I was going to say that the second point was the fact that a lot of the time we hear about the lack of productivity of farms in Africa, but it is also good to hear that there are actually some farms that are doing really great practices with great productivity, and that it's not such a binary. And I think talking about the consumers, I think is a great segue to look at what does just transitions mean for consumers. And actually, Aditi, I would like to come to you because I think I asked about the common but differentiated responsibility for farmers, but there's also that concept for consumers, right? Because the consumptions, the dietary patterns and associated emissions from consumers between developing countries and developed countries are very different.
Yes, exactly. No, that's a great question. And I think in some of these global discourses around just transitions, we do not adequately talk about the differences in consumption. So we were earlier discussing pastoral livelihoods. So I just wanted to come back to one issue around meat consumption. I think almost all of you in this room would have heard that all the new growth in animal source protein consumption, food consumption will come from Africa. Also, many of you would have heard that consumption of animal source protein has stagnated in Europe or kind of stagnating in Europe. And then you would see graphs like, Africa's consumption growing. So people are worried, okay, what happens with all the emissions if Africa consumes more, etc., etc. But what those graphs and story is not telling is the story of absolute numbers. Even with reduction or stagnation in consumption of, say, meat in Europe, an average European would still be consuming 60 to 70 kilos of meat per capita per year. While even with all the growth in Africa, by end of 2050, an average African would still be consuming less than 30 kilos. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are deep inequalities in the way we consume food. And unless those inequalities become a part of main course discourse, because right now the main course discourse for much of the developing world is fossil fuel use will happen in your country, it's stagnating elsewhere. Meat consumption will happen in your country, it's stagnating elsewhere. But where is the stagnation level? So I think for a just transition to happen, we would have to actually not only talk of stagnation of consumption in the rich countries, we have to talk about reduction in consumption in the rich countries and leave that room for increase in consumption in the lower and middle income countries, because this is where there are real nutritional deficiencies. So we cannot just say that, OECD countries are stagnating. They have to reduce the consumption. So I think we have to really deal with that consumption inequality before we say Africa needs to reduce emissions, because let's face it, with everything, Africa's overall historical emissions have been only 4 to 5% of the total emissions. So the moral and the responsibility is not here to reduce. But having said that, I also agree with Guy, there's no reason to replicate the mistakes of the past, right? That we can forge a new pathway which is more sustainable. Yeah.
Thank you, Aditi, for showing how complex as well, right? And the fact that there needs to be more responsibility from the consumers in the rich countries as well. Robert and Nima, again, same question in terms of policy environment, what is needed so that consumers are not in the just transition. Robert, maybe I'll come to you first.
Well, thank you very much. I would say that it's a question from a policy perspective. It's a question of identifying the outcome we desire, and then work towards the inputs and the activities that a policy needs to achieve. And in this case, I think we are moving beyond the question of adequate food to having adequate and nutritious food, the kind of food that we actually need, which is good food. That is beneficial to the society that we have, especially on the African continent. And I can give an example. In the East African region, we've got a maize problem. When there is declared a shortage of maize production, the maize crop is going to fail because of rainfall. There is a panic because the food is not going to be enough in that sense. And there's always a scramble to find other less nutritious, more expensive sources of maize. So my illustration is that the policy interventions to help with this this transition for consumers needs to begin from the support given to the farmers so that it can have a sort of a supply chain linkage to the consumers at the end. So that if we make sure we deal with the vulnerabilities that make food crops fail, so that we don't have to import expensive food. We also deal with the questions of quality of production so that we don't have poor nutrition food, so that we can avoid the rising healthcare healthcare costs from poor quality foods. And then from there, then you see from the upstream situation, we can begin to mainstream important interventions like agroecology. And when you mainstream that, you put your R&D in the right place, what will happen is that eventually, out on the other side of consumers, over time you will get good quality food production, but you'll also keep the costs low and try and make sure that you carry everybody with that transition. But this is not going to take a day or a year. It's going to take a lot of time, and it involves changing the mindsets of both the leaders in policy making, but also the farmers and the public. And I think maybe that's a good point for me to leave for Neema to carry through as a leader. Thank you.
I think when we're talking about these issues, it's generally also very critical, and I'm just going to kind of bring different perspectives together. I think it's important to one always also try and look at what do our policies currently say, and then two, what are those missing issues, and how can we bridge them? Because from what the prof was saying, and what's even CGR was talking about in terms of climate and the link to smallholder farmers and the impact that is, you find that for a lot of these things and decisions, for it to be sustainable, we need to have it documented. But I think it's important, and that's why having such a setting like the one here today, it's critical, because then we can have also country comparisons, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from what we're doing in different countries. But one factor I just want to bring in a different angle that we haven't really touched on is the issue of trade. So we also have to see how to lock all of this in and link it with trade, because there's huge opportunity of Africa trading within Africa, and there's lots of efforts towards that. We all know that how much Africa is spending on importing finished products. On the flip side of it, we're exporting raw. Should we be exporting raw, importing finished products? And then while we're talking about trade, there's also the key component of how can we link our agriculture, nutrition, and health together, and making sure that what's being produced by our smallholder farmers can fit the requirements, in particular of the health component of the markets that we're targeting. So for example, in the EU markets, EU markets, UK market, there are requirements of like the food safety requirements, but also on pesticide. He was talking about how farmers use pesticide, right? You find that it's very common to see smallholder farmer, they've already harvested their tomatoes, and that's when they spray, the pesticide to make the tomatoes not rot. But then Is that the ideal? And then when you come and try, when you want to meet the EU market, there's the issue of minimal chemical residue that has to be there. So how do we make sure that in everything that we're doing, we should also try constantly think about the market? And I'm a believer that we shouldn't produce in a safer way to meet a foreign market as opposed to the local market. It should be the same. It should be universal, irrespective of which market it is. Thank you.
Just to add more complexity to that, Nima, some of the pesticides that are being used in countries like, Tanzania and other parts of the, developing world are pesticides that are actually banned in places like the EU, but are still being produced and exported here. So there's another level of just transition that we're talking about.
And then actually on that same point, you find that the producers are coming from those countries who don't then want to buy the products from these countries. So it's a quite interesting component.
Absolutely. Mishak, last question before we open the floor for Q&A, and just to follow on from what Nima said about trade, because a lot of the global trade deals tend to favor the rich nations, the big nations, and the big farmers. How can we get just transition for small-scale farmers in East Africa when it comes to trade deals?
Well, when it comes to smallholder farmers, international trade and export becomes a very complex area to venture in, because they do not have enough information, they do not have the resources to invest, they do not have the skills, like to produce the quality, to meet the quality requirements needed by those markets. So in most cases, what happens in international trade, for example, with the smallholder farmers, they will be used by the traders who understand the market, those who have the resources, those who have the connections. So for smallholder farmers not to lose out within the just transition, I think we need to focus on a number of things to support smallholder traders. And one of those things is to ensure that we develop the local markets, because local markets, they can have the information, they can engage better, they can make connections, and they can produce what is relevant within those local markets. And also the local markets do not have like the stringent requirements such as like it is in the international market. So I think local market development is very important, extremely critical. Secondly is the honorable member was talking about credit and finance, because trade is a business. They need to invest. So they need money. They need access to money. They need access to finances. And that is a problem with smallholder farmers and also smallholder traders who want to engage in trade. So we need a framework, a policy support framework that enables smallholder traders, to be able to engage in business, to be able to invest in business. But most important also, when you look at the context of our communities, there are remote communities with undeveloped infrastructure. You find we have no power connection, the energy is a problem, road network is a problem. When it rains, you cannot move. And this is how some of these smallholder traders fail, because, if you don't move your fresh produce very fast to the market, what happens? They become waste. So those are some of the challenges, and those are some of the issues that we need to focus on. But most important also, information about, the crops, the quality, the nutrition, which is very important, and the connection of that to the consumers. Because when the traders, are retailing the whatever produce they are retailing, they are producing, and they were producing for a certain market, for consumers. And sometimes there's a dislink between what the farmers are producing and sometimes what the traders want. Professor was just talking about the maize, for example, which is a hype that if we don't have the maize in East Africa, then we don't have food. Yeah. So we need information and we need those connections so that the traders do what? They produce for what the market wants, and not just producing, but also producing the healthier foods, so that all the people, the children, the women, the pastoralists, and so on who are consuming this, they benefit from access to healthy diets. Yeah.
Right. We have about, I think, 10 minutes or so for question and answers. Can I just see a show of hands as to how many questions there are? Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I want to take 6. Okay, I want to take as many questions as possible to make sure. So let's try and do 2 rounds of 3 questions each. I will take 3 at a time, and then I'll throw it back to the panels, and they can answer it. So we'll make sure that we have. I'm so sorry. Can you raise your hands again, just to make? Okay, there's this lady here. Okay, we'll take from there, and then we'll come over to you for the second round. I'll make sure that I now see 7, so we'll make sure that I take all 7. Whether or not we can answer is another. So 1, 2, and 3 for the first round. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very insightful inputs and thoughts. This, I suppose, gave everyone a lot of food for thought. So I actually have 2 questions. They're directed to the whole panel. I would like to hear different perspectives on these. So the first one is whether you think that there is a role for true cost accounting in supporting farmers' incomes while transitioning to more agroecological or sustainable practices. Whether you think that putting a label, a price tag on foods that reflects its externalities and not just input cost might actually be a way to ensure that farmers that are willing to transition and would like to transition also manage to get some adequate revenues from their product. And then the second question is instead about scaling up the community level work that we heard about. How is it possible to ensure, given that, for example, digital access is a challenge, given that many farmers do not know how to use digital tools, software, etc., how do we ensure that these small scale community programs for peer-to-peer learning, for teaching farmers are actually scalable across communities, regions, and countries?
Hi, my question is also for the panel. So the causes of climate justice go beyond border, and how do you hold accountability? Especially we're talking about malnutrition, healthy diets, and like scalability, all these different things when you can literally drop a bomb and create more malnutrition. So how can we hold and who can be held responsible? Second thing I wanted to ask is the face of the sustainable consumption. So in our nutrition community, we tend to focus on Black and brown women and children, the malnutrition, undernutrition, all this stuff. But the people who are really responsible for high emission intense diets are urban, high income men. And increasingly, you're seeing climate inequalities within countries is just as high as between countries. So how do you braid these narratives in places like Tanzania, where you see you have two different priorities? Thank you.
Great. And I think there is a third question. The gentleman in green shirt. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick. I'm coming from Sierra Leone, Office of the President. I'm responsible for climate smart agriculture and food security. So that gives a context of the question I'm going to ask. Perhaps the parliamentarian can help us to situate this. Our countries are grappling with addressing 3 critical issues which this conference is addressing. 1, food insecurity, the availability itself. Number 2, high malnutrition, and the poor nutritional indicators that we have. Now, in the face of these 3 major problems that interact with our economies, that interact with job creation, and the fact that we are agro-dependent countries, how will the parliament, our parliament, help us to argue and promote agriculture in our countries in the face of a just transition, listening to what Gay actually explained? If in the developed countries, agriculture is becoming more expensive where technologies are available, how much more for our farmers that do not have access to technologies? Over the years, research has invested in creating knowledge, varieties, and production systems, which we may want to push aside as we move towards the just transition. I happen to also sit in the global policy group that discusses this issue, and I'm always advocating for this. How do you see our parliament helping us to argue better in this global forum? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for those questions. I'm going to, because we do want to take a second round, I'm going to have to ask our speakers to keep their answers very, very brief, and they may not, everyone might be able to answer it. I hope you'll have to follow up. Just to repeat, Nima, you might want to go first, because that was a direction that was, question that was directly addressed to you in terms of what can parliaments do. But there are also questions around the importance of true cost accounting, how to scale up community level work, especially in terms of training, where does accountability fit in, and in terms of what do we do with consumption mostly being driven by urban high income male? How do we change that narrative? But Nima, do you want to?
Thank you. I will start with the community one. I think in terms of how can we ensure that we take stock and learnings from community. One of the things that I like to say a lot is the importance of engaging and creating a platform for community organizations, NGOs, community NGOs, to be part of designing phases of new projects, but also to be part and parcel of the solution. And you find one of the things that community NGOs tend to face or challenge is that whenever there are call for proposals or call for funding, you find that the requirements are so stringent such that there is no way they can qualify. So we have to make sure that if we truly want those solutions to be there, or their involvement or their understanding to be there, we also have to find ways in which, when we're making call for proposals, to take into account that we should make deliberate efforts of also bringing on board the community organizations who can be paired with the national organizations, etc. When it comes to the parliamentarians, I think a good news for you is that parliamentarians, about two years ago, I joined up with 5 other members of parliament, one from Ghana, one from Congo Brazzaville, and myself from Malawi. So there was 4 of us, and we set up the African Food Systems Parliamentary Network, AFSPAN, which was launched 2 years ago. And the aim of that is to see how can we get parliamentarians across the continent. One, for us to get capacity building, because it's not like everybody gets into parliament with their own backgrounds and their own expertise. But 2, to also bridge the gap between policy and science. Scientists tend to do their scientific reports, and it remains in their own science world. But then, even if I take it, or if I'm interested in it as a policymaker, I don't understand the language. Everything is too scientific. So how can we bring the 2 worlds together, policy and science, in a manner in which can be understood and can be digestible? And through that, I think most of what you're saying we would be able to work together on. And one of our biggest achievement was earlier this year in January, for the first time in the new CADAP, in the new Africa Union CADAP strategy, parliamentarians have been recognized as a stakeholder, whereas previously parliamentarians were not recognized as a stakeholder. So I think with that going forward, it means lots of people who are even working under the CADAP, they're now going to be forced to engage with parliamentarians, whereas before it was not the case. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so to all the researchers and the scientists and academics in this room, make sure that your research is understandable, and there are policymakers who are willing to listen to you. Whoever turn up for that learning lab on Monday, how to make your research usable, go back and check if you have it. Aditi, any thoughts? Let's keep it brief, guys. We still have a couple more questions to go through. So.
Yes, no, 2 very brief thoughts. One around the question of true cost accounting. Yes, for sure. Particularly in countries where the income is high enough to afford food, and food is a small part of the total expenditure. But it would be quite tricky in many of the low income countries where food expenses are already so high. So there has to be a different kind of way. I mean, one of the central tenets of Paris Agreement is that none of the emission reduction should come at the cost of food security. So if the true cost accounting increases the cost of food and makes it unaffordable, that would not be a pathway that many of the low-income countries can or should go at all. So I think it's very important to differentiate what policies will work where. Which obviously you know very well. And on the issue of responsibility, I just want us to get back to the CBDR that we talked about. I mean, both Paris and UNFCCC has those mechanisms for climate justice. And the whole negotiation that happens year after year is about how can the countries which have actually historically caused climate change can pay and compensate the countries who haven't. Earlier, we talked about the drought that Professor Kibuki talked about. I mean, studies have shown that the current drought that happened had a very clear climate change fingerprint. That drought would not have happened unless there was this extra greenhouse gases put in the environment. So attribution studies have become very strong, and we can, for each and every event, show whether it was caused by climate change. So that kind of gives legal basis for compensation via the loss and damage funds, which has been set up. But such is the state of our world that we actually spend more on eating ice creams in a year than putting in climate finance. So basically 300 billion was the climate finance agreed last year, but basically it's not that there isn't money, there's a lack of political will. I mean, 7 trillion goes into fossil fuel subsidies. So there is a big issue out there, and I think research needs to constantly advocate for climate justice in all its form, and basically talk about climate finance. I mean, there's no getting around it. Those who have created climate change are morally responsible for paying for that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Aditi. Guy, can I come to you next on brief thoughts on the questions?
I mean, there's no question that the rich are the cause of most of the world's problems. You know, we consume too much, and to be suggesting that, you know, Africa has to address climate change. I mean, we are the cause of it, and we need to address it. And to address the true cost accounting, we have some examples of that in the UK. We have biodiversity net gain credits. I would say they've been a resounding failure. I would say all attempts at carbon taxation and setting a carbon price have not gone well so far. However, the evidence that how incredibly effective it could be, there have been reports by the IMF and the OECD suggesting really drastic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions were we to tax fossil fuels, and then we could use that revenue to distribute and address some of the inequality problems as well. So I'm definitely an advocate of taxing fossil fuels, and it's just jaw-dropping that we get to the end of each COP conference, and then there's about 5 minutes at the end where we debate whether we're going to phase down or phase out coal. I mean, it's just extraordinary, and a testimony to the lobbying power of the fossil fuel companies. So I am in favor of true cost accounting. I think it's incredibly complex. We need to reduce, try and minimize the number of things we're going to measure. And as the most important issue facing the world is, I think, climate change, we should start with fossil fuels. There was a thing about how do we spread agroecological practice, and I am a firm supporter. If you want to influence farmers, the best way to influence them is through other farmers, showing a farmer who's like them, who they can identify, changing their farming practices on land like theirs. And if they see that being successful, they will imitate it. And that's why I'm such a supporter of ripple effect and their peer farming approach to bringing about change. I mean, I've seen it in France, where I also farm. I've seen it in the UK, and I've seen it most effectively in East Africa. And that is the best way to bring about change. You can have as many academics as you like talking about how things should be, but farmers are influenced mostly by what other farmers do.
Great advice. Thank you. Robert?
I think my colleagues have taken most of the questions. I'll just add on to the point on true cost accounting. And I agree with Aditi's view on it. I would only add that really in all situations, the parameters considered in true cost accounting cannot be ad infinitum. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very, very costly and very ambiguous and have internal contradictions. And those parameters will vary from society to society. And I have a question for the person who asked the question and to the others. Would there be negatives as well for those who then overcome unimaginable vulnerabilities to still bring the food to the market, rather than the question of externalities And I think that would also be an important consideration to reconcile that problem. Thank you.
Mishak?
Let me just speak on community level work and scalability of digital solutions. I think we have engaged in this before with communities, and one of the lessons we have learned is sometimes we get into pitfalls by developing digital solutions. For example, say developing phone apps that are intended to provide certain solutions to communities. But then these are pegged on projects. So when they are pegged on projects, the project will support these solutions. And when the project comes to an end, normal as projects are, that also dies with it. It comes to an end. And we have struggled a little bit around that. But the lesson I learned and the lesson I can share now is there is a way that we can make this sustainable and scalable. And I will use the M-Pesa mobile money transfer, for example, in East Africa currently. You see, everybody, almost everybody who is on mobile phone is using that app to do financial transactions, to make payments and so on. What does that tell you? It tells you that first, the users need it. It is solving a certain problem for them. So there is need for that. And therefore, so when we are developing digital solutions to farmers, we need to understand from the farmer's perspective. Because when we are developing these digital solutions, we develop them from our own perspective. That is number one. Number two, when it comes to sustainability, I think we need to move away from free apps and free things because it will not work. For example, I said that during the project, you will find perhaps these apps is supported by the project because the developers of these apps are actually entrepreneurs, are digital entrepreneurs. So they're also looking for profit. So we should not be looking for profit from project which will come to an end in 5 years. We should find a mechanism where the users can finance these digital apps. Whether it is a USSD, when the farmer dials the USSD, it can, deduct some cents, and then those cents can be used to, sustain the digital entrepreneur into that business with the farmers.
Great. So we have a hard stop in 5 minutes, but I am going to keep my promise and get all your questions. But that means you have to make sure that your questions are extremely concise and short. I know that there are questions over there. So we'll take all three. And I think there is one from online. No, okay. We'll take those three and then we'll have to close. If you keep your questions very, very short and concise. Thank you.
Yeah, mine is very quick to the professor, my colleague at the University of Nairobi. Nice to see you. And the MP. When you talk of just transitions, the fact of equity and inclusivity come into play. I've not heard the role of youth. If you look at the news today in Kenya, the youth, the Gen Z are out on the streets fighting for their rights. If you want to have increased agricultural productivity and food production, we need to engage the youth. We have 80% unemployment in Africa. How can we make our policies? And that's why I'm throwing it to the lawyer and also to the government. How do we make enabling environment and policies that are conducive to the youth? Because if you talk of robotics, smart irrigation, all these technologies, they are being done by the youth. How do we bring them in?
Great, thank you. I know that there are two. There are two over there in the middle row. Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have two questions. One goes to Meshach. I would like to know how the likelihood of sustainability of the projects that you are conducting, because I heard you are getting money from the UK. And when you rely on donor funding, I think there's a problem. But also I would like to, there's the issue, I think I'm getting a mixed message that when it comes to paying, definitely somebody has to pay for the just transitions. And how are the African governments ready to pay? Because we cannot wait for the West to pay for our food. We need people to eat cheap food in the towns, the poor people, but somebody has to pay. How are the governments ready to do that? Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a final question from, I think, gentleman behind.
Yes, I have a question I'd like to ask the panel. How do we ensure as farmers, youth, women, and marginalized rural communities are included in the decision-making process and benefit from the just transition? And my second question is, what institutions and NGOs must implement which policies that balance climate goals with rural development to ensure fair access to land, finance, and technology? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great that all of you have so many questions and are so interested in this topic, but unfortunately, we're going to have to keep the answers extremely precise. We're going to go straight to the online speakers first. Robert, Guy, you have 30 seconds each. Robert, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. I think I can give an example. I visited a company in Nairobi called Gearbox Europe Laser that was staffed by very young and very knowledgeable electrical and mechatronics engineers, all trained in Kenya, who are preparing robotics and electronic solutions for fish farming and for irrigation and related aspects. I think that goes to the point that with the 75% of population below the age of 35, there is need for the agriculture value chain to align itself with the knowledge and skills that are going to be beneficial to generate business and food and relevant to the population that we have. Thank you.
Great. Guy? You're on mute again, Guy.
So those are quite continent-specific questions, I think, and probably outside my experience. But I just thought it might be interesting that there are a lot of young people in the UK now who are disenchanted with their urban industrialized lives and actually do want to return to the land and work, perhaps in a slightly idealistic and unrealistic way. And actually, some of the more successful smallholder farmers in Europe, it's kind of interesting that is what a lot of people are aspiring to in the UK now, who are rejecting our very materialist ways. So that may be of interest. I don't think I can comment on the other questions. Thank you.
That's fine, Guy. Mishak, do you want to talk about the answer very, very quickly, the sustainability question?
Thank you. Sustainability, it doesn't depend on where you get the money. You can get money from anywhere, whether it is UK, whether it is local, and so on. Getting money and sustainability are two different things. Sustainability is how you approach your programming with the communities. That's what determines sustainability. Secondly, let me also make a correction that we don't just get money from the UK. We get money even from local donors, including governments. Yeah, thanks.
Nima, there's also a question to you about youth and policy.
Thank you. I think on the youth there, what I can say is that not only our neighbors, Africa and the world can learn from Tanzania. Under Her Excellency President Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, we launched the Building Better Tomorrow project, BBT, which is a project that is, fully focusing on the youth, getting youth to be engaged in the agricultural sector, but also making sure youth get access to land, access to financing, and the like. So that is a key component there. But also on a personal level, through an NGO that I had founded about back in 2017 under the UN FAO, there is something called the World Food Forum, WFF, which brings together lots of youth to engage in the food systems ecosystem. So we are the ones who are hosting the World Food Forum here in Tanzania, and we're working towards making sure that other countries within, at least starting with the SADC region, also have World Food Forum chapters. And I know currently that Kenya is on the final stages of also launching their own forum. And then finally, in terms of, there was something about how we can get people to be part of the decision-making processes. I think number one is as citizens, but also as people who are keen to understand the process, is to research on how your different ministries operate, but also know your parliamentarians or your local representatives at the ward level. engage with them, ask them questions, and invite them whenever you have that discussions. It needs to be, so it needs to be a two-way traffic. So we both have to invest in that relationship. Thank you.
Aditi, last word to you, last brief words.
Yes, thank you. I think I wanted to take the question on who pays. I think that is at the heart of the issue, who pays for just transition. So here, a lot of work is going around. I think while we are all disenchanted with the international processes, but these COP processes are still some of the best bets in which the developing countries can actually get finance from the developed countries, and Africa as a whole negotiates as one united group. And I think the pressure has to be kept up for that climate finance to come through. So there's now loss and damage plus the NCQG. There are two finance streams that are being discussed, and I think that would be one important way. The other would be realigning some of the fossil fuel subsidies that countries within the countries provide. So how do we realign those subsidies and put it to less environmentally damaging things? How do we subsidize good practices instead of subsidizing bad practices? And where does the money come from in the rich countries? There's also a lot of discussions around taxing the top 1%. Literally, it's the top 1% who have caused climate change. The emissions comes from, like, they have been responsible for the disproportionate share of climate change. So I think finance is something that needs to be tackled, and advocacy, research, everything has to go towards keeping up that pressure in those international spaces, that these are the countries that are most climate vulnerable and need that finance to do the transition. So if I don't know if that helps, but I don't see many other options right now except to keep up the pressure.
Great, thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause to our speakers? Thank you.